Well, good afternoon, and welcome to part 6 of our 6-part presentation looking at the United States Constitution. And we were talking from the framework of last week, going into more of the 19th century and continuing on into the 20th century. Specifically here, looking at constitutional amendments as to how they pertain, in essence, to the nation as a whole and the impact that it would invariably have. Well, we had referenced, the reason I'm starting with this, we talked about it at the conclusion last time, but the reason we're starting with it is because present-day history, I should say, or current events, yesterday as the Supreme Court was looking primarily not so much at the 13th Amendment in the aftermath of the American Civil War in 1865, which abolished the institution of slavery, not the 14th, I should say rather it was the 14th Amendment, which also then ties in essence, to not just equal protection, but also birthright citizenship. So the issue here, and it's made abundantly clear in the American Constitution, that what you have, in essence, is if you are born in this country, you are a citizen of this country. Now, at the time this was written, by the same end, the population of the United States was still relatively small, at least by comparison to European standards. And in this situation, you have a case that certainly it was meant, no doubt about this, for slaves who are now effectively citizens, they're effectively free. You abolish slavery, you have this equal protection amendment. If you're born in this nation, you are a citizen. But it is also crystal clear that this is going to pertain here to future generations of a nation. In this immigrant nation, which is what we are for immigrant people, unless we're Native American. They represent Native Americans just under 1% of the population in this nation, but in this situation, they are the only true Americans. All of us or our ancestors were transported, whether willing or unwilling, from some other place on the globe. Well, in this situation, it's crystal clear. Followed up here by the 15th Amendment, the right to vote to all males, because the concern here on the part of the Republicans in particular, who are in control of the United States House of Representatives as well as the Senate, the issue that they have here is one that across the southern states, southern whites are going to keep blacks from the polling booth. They're going to treat them here, they're not going to give them equal protection as citizens, even though they are. They're born in this country, therefore they're citizens. By the same end, slavery is abolished, crystal clear. It's a federal crime from this time onwards to, in fact, even to formally attempt to enslave someone. I mean, it's a bit of a long shot in that regard, but nevertheless, that's the issue. So you have here in this 14th Amendment, the vote was cast yesterday, and for constitutional historians, they were surprised that the vote was 6-3, because this clearly should have been something 9-0. It shouldn't even have been 6-3. Well, birthright citizenship here is officially a thing. It's part of the Constitution, 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and in that regard here you have this continuation. There's also a movement on the part of the United States at this time, is that they were looking for citizenry. They were looking here for newcomers to this nation, as many as possible, because quite frankly, the United States, as we may well remember, in 1800 had a population of 5 million people. It's very, very small here, certainly by European standards, but even by global perspectives, especially considering how much land, in essence, the nation officially occupied, especially in the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So you have this transition, you have this transformation going on, but here over the course of the first half of the 19th century, the federal government was looking to get more and more people in this nation, if at all possible. The population would grow. It would grow. It would, in fact, here formally expand. But by the same end, it would be slower than what was anticipated. So you have here the issue, as I referenced last week, is due to the fact that it seemed for outsiders that civil war in this nation was inevitable. And the last thing you wanted here, if you were considering emigrating from Europe to the United States, the last thing you wanted was to be drafted in the Army. Whether you settled in the South, it would be the Confederacy, or you settled in the North, it would be the Union Army. This was not of a concern to you. Your concern here is in search of a better life. You don't want to end up in a war. So in this case, the movement here of new immigrants, these old immigrant class, which comes over from 1820 up until about 1850, you've got here well over 10 million new Americans rolling in, and the population of the United States is going to grow, no doubt about that. But by the same end, they were staying back, staying on the fringe, so to speak, and staying on the fringe because of the issue of the American Civil War. Once the war ends in 1865, once the war here, in fact, effectively ends in 1865, now, once again, the federal government is going to look. It is going to look towards significantly increasing here the population of this nation. Well, what happens, we had referenced the Reconstruction of the United States and got into what would be, in essence, the failure of Reconstruction. We talked about the conclusion of our presentation last time, that you have, in essence, a disputed election. Disputed election in 1876. Ulysses S. Grant here, his concern, his obsession, quite frankly, was with the historic South. The South ceases to exist in 1865, at least temporarily. It'll be divided into 5 military districts. It'll be occupied, in essence, here by soldiers from the Union Army, the Federal Army, now the United States Army, back again once officially. And the issue was to keep an upper hand on things. Well, it didn't work. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? It didn't work simply because you didn't have enough soldiers. You didn't have enough soldiers. So you have these white supremacist organizations rising, as we referenced last week as well. And here, the Ku Klux Klan was the largest of them all, this Confederate fraternal organization with its origins in the state of Tennessee in 1863. Well, in 1865, now that the war is in essence a lost cause, what will happen is the Klan is going to receive here this secret army, so to speak. It is going to receive more and more recruits, and they're going to go off and they're going to terrorize blacks across the historic South, keeping them from the polling booths, keeping them from voting, keeping them, I should say, from holding legislative office, even if they had been elected, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the violence here is going to reach greater and greater levels of proportion. So with the Ku Klux Klan Act, in 1871, Ulysses S. Grant is going to send in federal troops. Well, what happens here is he's believing firmly that these troops have to be kept in the South until well into the 20th century, well into the early 20th century at the latest. And here, as he has served 2 terms in office, he'll follow, in essence, this agreement, so to speak. He served 2 terms at this time. It's not a constitutional amendment, not as of yet. He's going to retire off to Galena, Illinois. And in 1876, in November here, you have the election for the new president. Tilden wins, of course, the popular vote. Rutherford B. Hayes wins the electoral vote by 1 vote. And you have, because of this electoral college, you have a constitutional crisis. If you go by the person who wins the most votes, well, Samuel Tilden won the election by more than 200,000. But remember, the founding fathers here in Philadelphia in 1787 didn't have a lot of confidence with the average person being able to choose the right individual. Therefore, you put in the insurance policy, the Electoral College. Well, in this case, you have a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis. And the Tilden camp is going to fight this and fight this and fight this because they had the most popular votes, no doubt about it. By the same end, the Democrats had been out of office for a long time. As far as this New York politician was concerned, it was about time for the Democrats to return to the Oval Office. And from Hayes' standpoint, the Hayes camp's attitude was we won the election because we won by 1 electoral vote. It doesn't mean if we won by 100, if we won by 50, we won by 1, we won. Well, what to do? The Compromise of 1877. And in this case, you avoid a constitutional crisis. But at the end of the day here, the election is going to be awarded to Rutherford B. Hayes. And on the premise here for the Democrats, who are very prominent across the historic South, prominent across here the historic South, for the Democrats, what they are going to get in return is all of these federal forces that had been with the Ku Klux Klan Act. You tripled, then you quintupled the amount of federal forces here, which is going to push these white supremacist organizations here underground, quite frankly, domestic terrorists, to use a present-day example or present-day phrase. It forces them here to, in essence, back off. Well, now, these federal troops, In 1877, with this compromise, Hayes, the Republican's the new president. But the Democrats are also going to have, as part of this compromise, they're the prominent political party of the South, all these federal troops are going to be removed. And when all is said and done, what we end up with here is a situation that you have, in fact, the civil rights movement, which will have its origins really in 1944, 1945 at its embryonic stage, will come to the surface in the 20th century. Because these dreams, these hopes, these visions, no longer here will black Americans be enslaved. No longer will they be viewed as property. They'll be viewed as human beings. Step up, no doubt about that, quite frankly, long overdue. But by the same end here, they are going to be second-class citizens. They're no longer going to be slaves. They're going to be sharecroppers in the vast majority of cases. Well, for the U.S. nation here, it is going to grow quite dramatically over the course of the 19th century. And we stress the fact that by the time we get to 1880, we have a total of 76 million residents. 76 million residents here in this nation. Now, it was a natural growth. The old immigrants here are going to join those who could trace their ancestry to colonial America. And here, what we end up with, or what we see, is a nation that is fairly large in terms of population. Certainly here, in the aftermath of the American Civil War, the nation is going to modernize, it's going to industrialize. This will be true not just in the continuation process of the Northeast and the Midwest, it is also going to be true across the Mississippi, California, which was already long on the road to modernization, to industrialization prior to the American Civil War. Well, that is only going to intensify, and added to this, of course, will be the historic South in this transition, this transformation. So you have here the nation gradually, slowly but surely here moving forward, and it becomes here, in essence, a very, very attractive place indeed. The sectarian crisis, the wounds are going to continue here between North and South for generations to follow. The sectarian crisis of the nation has come to an end. The Union is in essence preserved, and you will have now this massive influx of these new immigrants who are going to arrive in this nation between the years of 1881 to 1921. For black Americans, particularly following here the failure of Reconstruction, as far as many of them are concerned, living under Jim Crow, treated as complete and total second-class citizens, as far as black Americans are concerned here, they're going to pack their bags and start moving northwards. They're going to go west, they're going to go north and northeast, into Midwest, into cities here, across the historic areas, out of the region of the South. Why? Simple, because there's hope, there's opportunities. There's not such a level of institutionalized racism, though quite frankly, racism is also alive and well, I can guarantee you that much, in the northern states, in the Northeast, the Midwest, as well as the western states. But as far as countless black Americans are concerned, as far as black people are concerned here, there's really nowhere to go but up. You've got to find here a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And so you have this transition, this transformation going on in the nation as well here as the late 19th, early 20th century formally progresses. Well, the problem in a story here of this immigrant nation for immigrant people that is told over and over again is over and over again here as you bring these countless masses. You have the story with the Statue of Liberty and her representation of what she means symbolically for this nation. And here, in this case, you have a pecking order that was in existence going all the way back to the time in the early 19th century of the old immigrants, as they eventually become known as, being looked down upon, being viewed here as second-class standing by the colonial Americans. The colonial Americans. If you came over on that boat, or your ancestors did, earlier than any newcomers, well, you were a step up in the so-called totem pole. And in this situation, what you'll see is this nation that's dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The term WASP is oftentimes used. A Protestant nation for Protestant people. And you have, in essence, now suddenly, this transition, this transformation with these new immigrants The colonial Americans came overwhelmingly from the British Isles. They came from the British Isles, from historic Scotland, England especially, but also Wales and Ireland. But for the Irish who came, the Irish here who came to the United States as part of the old immigrant movement, overwhelmingly they were Protestant. Overwhelmingly here they were Protestant. Well, now what we're going to see is we're going to see with this new immigrant movement, as the federal government is literally throwing the doors open and looking for newcomers to this nation, you'll see this mass migration, this mass transition, transformation across the board with these new immigrants. And the impact would in fact formally prove to be profound. The population of the United States, population here of the United States in 1880 was 76 million. By the time we get to 1920, time we get here to 1920, it will be 109 million. And we talked in earlier presentations at Milwaukee Catholic over the years in terms of the overall impact or overall effect that this would formally have. Because no longer with the colonial Americans coming from the British Isles, the old immigrants here, they're also coming from the British Isles, but also from parts of Western Europe. It's a very Eurocentric nation here as the 19th century progresses. What we end up with when all is said and done is we see this transition, this transformation now of people from all different parts of the globe. 70% of them here are coming from Europe. But the majority of those 70% of European immigrants, the majority of them, where they are coming from is Eastern Europe. They're coming from Eastern Europe. And by the same end, as far as mainstream American society is concerned, nativist American society was concerned here, these people cannot be true Americans. And it's not just here these residents who are coming from Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was viewed as being about 100 years behind the times to Western Europe. I would say, in fairness, that's fairly accurate. I would say that was true in 1890. I would say it is also true in 2026. So you have here East European nations are trying to catch up more to West European nations like Germany, like France, like Britain, etc., Italy. Proved to be here a monumental challenge. But now 70% of these newcomers from 1881 to 1921 here in this time where they're coming from is Eastern Europe, and you have here a sizable minority of West European Americans arriving as well, or West Europeans here arriving in this nation of the United States. But the problem here, fundamentally, is these East Europeans and especially these massive amounts of Catholics. And you had a population in 1880, a population here in 1880, a Roman Catholic population of just over 3%. Back in colonial times, if you were Catholic, you lived in the state of Maryland. That was your place. You were not to live outside of Maryland. Well, here, a very small fragment of the population, now suddenly, holy mackerel, you're having millions of Catholics pouring in, and they're coming. And they're coming not just from Europe, they are also here pouring in from Mexico. They are pouring in from Canada. The Philippines, those are the other three big places here that they're in fact going to effectively arrive. So you have this population that is really rolling in, and they're settling here in large numbers, settling in American cities. In 1910, the city of Milwaukee, which in the present day is the 38th largest city in the United States, 1910 it was the 9th largest city in the U.S. Oftentimes referred to here as German Athens, as you had one German socialist mayor here in this city after another. There's a book that came out in the 1980s called Socialism in America. Literally, I would say almost 70% of the entire book is dedicated to Milwaukee. Well, it's this immigrant city that, holy mackerel, is going to take off to the high heavens. Always overshadowed here by Chicago going back to the mid-19th century. It is going to grow and grow significantly with this new immigrant population. Remember, by 1920, 70% of the population of the city of Milwaukee was born outside of this country. Oh dear God, that's a lot. Well, in this situation, the issue here is their Catholicism. They are these newcomers, overwhelmingly. They are dominated in the vast majority of cases, whether they're coming from Mexico or they're coming here from Europe, as Catholics. These Catholics can never be good Americans. They're the rock bottom of the barrel. They're lazy, they're stupid, they reproduce like rabbits, especially the Irish. And in this situation here, their loyalty is to the Pope in Rome. They do not understand the foundations of liberty and freedom. And in fact, what they're going to be doing here is they're going to be dominating the prison rolls across this great land of ours, and they are going to destroy our nation from within. Well, the Irish here are portrayed in the media, in countless cartoons. The Irish male is portrayed as this gorilla-like figure and a subhuman being, Paddy. Got to call out the paddy wagon for drunken Paddy yet again. He's brawling, he's in jail, so on and so forth. The female, of course, Nora or Bridget, she was placed in a very, very similar league. Not as disgusting as Paddy by any means, but she was really, really slow, really not bright, let's just say. And in this situation, for the Irish, because they're the first major Catholic group, they are going to, in essence here, experience the heart and soul of the discrimination. But as opposed to taking this, because they had been used and abused by the British for centuries, they knew all what it was like to be treated as second class, being Catholics, because the British here, in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and Henry VIII and all that, the English Reformation, would see the Irish in even more of a second-class standing. So they've been routinely discriminated against. They knew it, they got it, no doubt about that whatsoever. But when they arrived in this nation, the attitude is one of, we expect more from the Americans, from this government. And you had St. Patrick's Day, which was always here a holy day of obligation. Back in Dublin, wasn't a day of revelry or partying. In 1854 in New York City, all that's going to change. It's going to change. And the Irish here, who are viewed as being loud and obnoxious brawlers, etc., are going to flaunt their Irish identity every March 17th, the wearing of the green. Parties and singing, etc., sticking it in essence in the faces of mainstream American society who will not accept them because they are different. What happens? What happens here is it pushes up as other Catholic groups come in. The Germans are the second major Catholic group. They push the Irish up the social ladder. The Irish go here from being shanty Irish to being lace curtain Irish. The German Catholics are followed up here by the Italian Catholics. The Italian Catholics are going to push the German Catholics up, followed then by finally the Polish Catholics, who are going to enter in rock bottom in terms of the Catholic world, but they're going to push up the other groups as well up the social ladder. You've got this pecking order even in this bit of a microcosm in the Catholic framework of things. And you would think, for the Irish Catholics, for God's sakes, they would know what it was like. Perhaps if not if they're first generation, but if they were second generation, they hear the stories of what their parents or their grandparents went through in this nation, that they would be a bit more open-minded. They weren't, unfortunately. Unfortunately, it's human nature. What happens here with the Irish by the early 20th century is they became prominent here as politicians, especially in civil service positions, and as well, fire department, you have the stereotype of the Irish cop, a stereotype of the Irish fireman. It's dead on accurate, no doubt about that. What happens here is a situation that the Irish, as far as they're concerned, what you would want is for your son to be a priest. My son, the priest. He needs to enter the holy orders. My daughter, the convent is where she belongs. If that doesn't happen, that's okay. You're going to marry another Irish Catholic here in the United States, that's for sure. And if you don't marry an Irish American, good Catholic, by the way, this thought when I was little, good and Catholic went hand in hand. You have to marry here, you could marry a German Catholic. It's a bit of a stretch, but they're clean. What that meant, I'm not exactly sure, but that was always the phrase that was used. The Germans are clean, and clean is a good thing. But stay away from the Italian Catholics and the Polish Catholics. They are way below us. Way below us. So you have here a bit of a pecking order in a microcosm here in ethnic America. Nevertheless, by 1920, the Catholics make up 23% of the U.S. population. There's too many of them. There's safety in numbers. Safety in numbers here, and as far as they're concerned, by God, they are going to fit into this nation just like anybody else who came to this nation is going to. They deserve to be here, they shall be here, and they prospered tremendously. By the same token, Jews who are coming overwhelmingly from Eastern Europe, less than 0.1% of the population in 1880. By the time we get to 1920, 3% of the population of this nation was Jewish. The single largest Jewish population in the world resided in the United States. That was true by 1920. It is also true in the present day. Present-day Jews make up about 2.6% of the population of this nation, but still it's the single largest population. So you have here a case, a transition, a transformation, the search here for these others, so to speak, trying in essence to fit in, trying in essence to embrace this American dream. And in this case, the road ahead would be difficult for the vast majority of these newcomers in this nation. To be perfectly honest, you would have been better off if you had stayed in your own respective nation, as opposed to coming to the United States. Because for first-generation Americans, it was brutally difficult. This is where the discrimination would reach you to the high heavens. Trying to find a job, trying to hold on to a job, this became an enormous challenge. Here's the streets of Milwaukee, a photograph here from the early 1890s, crossing the Milwaukee River. Well, for these new immigrants here, they're going to represent this manufacturing boom. And it's a good time. You never have a crystal ball to see here in this journey of life in terms of timing being everything or things working out ultimately, as the saying goes. Well, what you have here for the nation, now in the late 19th century, there are countless job opportunities, and the United States, from 1878 to 1898, the GNP, or gross national product, of this nation is going to increase 35%. Manufacturing in this 20-year time period is going to skyrocket 180%. Agricultural production will increase 26%. And the boom, so to speak, here in the late 19th century America, the boom was caused here by railroad construction primarily. You could always find work on the railroad. Always. It was horrific. It was awful. It was brutally difficult, no doubt about that. But you could also always here, in fact, find work on the railway. Well, second of all, technology. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s in Britain, it's going to transition, it's going to transform not only Britain, but also France, the nation of Germany as well, followed by Japan and the United States. Well, industrial America really starts taking off here in the late 19th century. With better trains, you have the introduction of steel mills. Telephones will be introduced here in the 1870s, along with the electric light. Typewriters, skyscrapers here, because of the introduction in steel, they will become all the more prominent in the 1880s, along with generators, refrigerators, internal combustion engines. And you have, in essence, a nation that the rich in this capitalist state are also going to get a lot richer. John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry, J.P. Morgan in banking. But you see, with this massive introduction of people power in this nation, what happens is the United States is now really going to be able to take off to an astronomical proportion. And there was, and there is, in the present day, a very subtle subtlety about the United States to blend in, to assimilate. And you have all of these new groups. It may take a generation, sometimes 2 generations, but you have here more and more of this distinct American identity. And for all intents and purposes, at the dawn of the 20th century, the Constitution here is remaining, in essence, this living, breathing document, but it has very, very few amendments that had been effectively added. And what takes place is the United States, as this manufacturing power at the start of the new immigration movement in 1881. the United States, in terms of overall manufacturing from a global perspective and industrial output, it stood in the number 4 position, behind Britain, France, and Germany. By the time we get to 1910 in manufacturing, the United States has here outproduced. It has outproduced here Germany, which is now in the 2nd spot, followed by France in the number 3 spot, and then Britain in the 4th spot. But what the Americans are doing by 1910 is they're outproducing here these nations combined at a rate of 2 to 1. Now the U.S. century, the American century, really doesn't begin until 1915 officially, but you have here this transition, you have indeed this transformation. Well, what happens? What happens is you still have this tension between the nativist population, especially here if they had been born in this country or if they could trace their ancestry back all the way to colonial times, you were even more important then. But by the same end, the old immigrants are also going to end up, the old immigrant movement really wraps up by 1850. There's bits and pieces, traces that go on till the 1880s before we end up with the new immigrants. What you have here with these old immigrants from Britain and Ireland, Scandinavia, Central European nations, they are viewed, they are accepted, capable of assimilation. The new immigrants, as I've referenced before, as far as mainstream American society is concerned, absolutely not. Absolutely not. They are incapable of assimilation. Their loyalties are elsewhere, especially for Catholics and Jews, no doubt about this. They are going to destroy our Protestant nation for Protestant people. This is what we're going to get when all is said and done. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. They represent here this criminal element. By the time we get into the early 20th century, here as the nation progresses, moves on, what you have is this division, a division between traditional America and modern America. And as far as traditional America was concerned, it was dominated. It was dominated overwhelmingly by colonial Americans as well as descendants here of the old immigrant class. Traditional America would argue that the Bible is the absolute truth. All you need in this journey of life, the only thing you need is the Bible. It is the perfect roadmap here from cradle to grave. By the same end, traditional America would argue in this nation that women and minorities are not equal. They are not equal to white men. It's a man's world through and through. That's the way God intended, so that's the way it is, plain and simple. Third, what they saw with these new immigrants, the biggest problem. The biggest problem here that they saw was the consumption of alcohol. And when you have here a situation as a newcomer to this nation in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you can see the economy allegedly is doing well. Oh yes, you have resets, you have recessions, no problems, no doubt about that. That's inevitable in a capitalist society. Nothing too overly severe. It's kind of like a swinging back and forth of the pendulum. But by the same end, you can't find work in many cases. In many cases, many of the first generation Americans would turn to alcohol. In some cases to drugs as well. Morphine was a major drug of habit here in the late 19th century. Well, in this case here, it's breaking up families. It's leading to an increase of crime. Remember, I was using as our example Irish Americans. In the 1890s, in fairness to mainstream American society, Irish Catholic males dominated the prison rolls. They did. And so Paddy and company were viewed here as incapable of assimilation, and they're thugs, they're criminals, they're hopeless across the board. Well, there was some evidence to that as well. I mean, it wasn't all just in terms of ignorance and bigotry by any means. You could point to the prison rolls. If we get rid of alcohol, this movement of prohibition, if we get rid of it, the dries, as they were also referred to as well, coming forth from traditional America, we can solve literally 80% of the social ills in this nation. The breakup of families, the high crime rate because we have an increasing crime population. And who's responsible for that? It's all the new immigrants. It's all the new immigrants. They can't fit in. We've been saying this here for years. And we've got to get to the root of the matter. And we've got to, in essence here, with God as our guide, follow through and outlaw the buying and selling of alcoholic beverages. It has become here this tremendous social evil. Wow. for modern America, which the majority of modern Americans here were part of the new immigrant class in the early 20th century. Their attitude was as follows: the Bible's good, it's very good, it's excellent in terms of a roadmap for life. But by the same end, science here in the scientific revolution has made all sorts of changes, all sorts of transitions, transformations that also should be here formally or effectively embraced. The Bible is good, but science matters too. We have, for example, life expectancy in 1880 of your average American was 48 years. By the time you get to 1910, it had increased to 54 years, looking more to be like 56 years by the time we get to 1920. That was progress, and that was science, because the life expectancy had changed very, very little over the course of time. Women and minorities are equal to white men. Yes, indeed, going back to the Founding Fathers, going all the way back to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Philadelphia, what you have here are these white borderline aristocrats in the vast majority of cases, here setting all this up. And that's the way pretty much it's been throughout the entire 19th century as well. But minorities here, as well as women, they are on the same footing. This is absurd to claim the lesser sex, or to claim that someone, because of the color of their skin, is secondary, is not up to speed with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. Third, as far as modern America is concerned, alcohol, you're overstating the case. Overstating here the case. And prohibition, the outlawing, buying of selling of alcohol is not going to help matters. It won't help matters by any stretch of the imagination. Well, what you have here is, for the traditional American movement, it's prohibition. It's prohibition. Now, the dries, as they're known as, coming forth from traditional America, they're not looking here to outlaw alcohol consumption. If you've got a wine cellar here in the 1920s in your basement in Racine, that's perfectly acceptable. But you can't take that wine out and sell it, and you can't go and purchase wine. So in this situation, the attitude is one of, we're going to outlaw the buying and selling of it. We've got to get to the root of this problem, straighten this out once and for all. It's a noble experiment. God wills it. Well, as far here as modern America was concerned, of course they oppose prohibition, if it's going to come into action or not. They weren't entirely sure. But as far here as modern America was concerned, the focal point here became one right out of the gate of the rights for women to vote. Women should have the right to vote here in this country. All adult males, once they reach 21, have the right to vote in this country. They're arguing here in the early 20th century. So too should be the case with women. Well, what the American suffragettes are looking at and watching and monitoring very closely is across the Atlantic Ocean, the island nation of Britain. Because you have here in Britain, the suffragette movement is also alive and well. And women were second-class citizens in this country. They're second-class citizens as well in Britain, virtually from a global perspective. And in this situation here, British women coming forth from the 19th century, which was the British century after all, the 19th century, the British century. For women, what they are looking at here is they are looking for this demand for all women having the right to vote. All men have the right to vote, so why not women? Well, Emmeline Pankhurst here is going to set up the Women's Social and Political Union. She'll set up here the Women's Social and Political Union, and what they're going to do, what these British suffragettes are going to do, is they are going to demand votes for women. And it all starts on March 1st, 1912. And what these women are going to do on March 1st of 1912, they're going to go over to the high-end shopping areas in all of London. Haymarket Street, Bond Street, etc. And at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, they're carrying here in their purses, inside their coats, etc., have them up their sleeves of their jackets. They are going to pull out hammers and axes, as well here as chisels, and just start smashing all of these storefront windows, acting in a way that is most unladylike, I'll have you know. Once they do all this damage, there's 120 of them around the city of London. They drop here these hammers, etc. And what they're going to do is they're going to wait to be arrested. Well, they know they're going to gain publicity because they've been told time and time again by the Liberal Party here in Britain, you just need to be patient. You just need here to formally be patient and everything will be okay. You'll eventually have this right to vote. Well, they've lost their patience. They've lost their patience here. And the net result is now they're going to be hauled off to jail. Well, they will pay a fine. They'll be released from prison, but they're not done. Here's Emmeline Pankhurst. What she's going to do, along with the other suffragettes, is they're going to start chaining themselves here to the gates of Buckingham Palace. They're going to start taking here rags, dipping them in gasoline, setting them on fire, and putting them in mailbox of the politicians on the floor of the House of Commons, demanding votes for women. They're going to take acid on the greens here of these golf courses where the politicians all go. They're going to carve it with acid on the putting greens, votes for women. Well, in this case, as far here as you can see, Emmeline Pankhurst, all 4 feet 10 inches of her, being carried off to prison. From their standpoint, they're still not making much progress, so now they're going to go on hunger strikes. They're going to go on hunger strikes. And in this situation, this is going to be highly publicized. Dear God, is this big of a deal? Shouldn't we take this step? And the American suffragettes are watching the same thing and monitoring it very, very closely, and they had been on board from the very start. Well, with these suffragettes here in these London jails and elsewhere throughout Britain, when they go on a hunger strike, now they're going to be force-fed. They're going to have tubes put down their throat. Their jaws will be broken in some cases. It's horrific. It's awful. And in this situation, in this case, it goes from bad to worse. Because Emily Davison, on June 4th, 1913, graduated from Oxford University. It is the Derby Day, the King's Day to go out riding. And what she's going to do, you can even see this on YouTube, she is going to go here and commit the ultimate sacrifice. You can see on film from this day, she's climbing up on the rail. It's like a huge Kentucky Derby track. And as the king's horse is coming in, she throws herself in front of the horse, and she's trampled to death. Now you have, in essence here, a martyr for the cause. A martyr for the cause. Well, in this situation, the American suffragette movement had its origins all the way back in Seneca Falls in 1848. And the same demand of vote for women. Why not? Think about it. Why shouldn't women be viewed as an equal class or on equal footing to males? And here, as time marches on, in the United States, NAUSA is going to be formally established. And in this case, 1890, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to be here at the forefront demanding votes for women. This is long overdue. We have all these newcomers coming in here. They're all going to be citizens. All the males can vote. We can't. We can trace our ancestry back generations, in some cases to colonial America. It's long overdue. Well, the Supreme Court was unsympathetic. Unsympathetic. No, it's not going to happen. There are no modern nations where women have the right to vote, and we're not going to be the first. We are not going to be the first. Traditional America is bitterly opposed to these troublemakers. Who do these women think they are, etc. Well, the states, especially in the western part of the United States, were more sympathetic, and women in this nation could vote. They could vote in Wyoming in 1869 as well as Utah, given the right to vote in 1870. So it could be done by a state-by-state basis. But what they recognized here and what was needed was in fact this constitutional amendment, a constitutional amendment. Well, from the standpoint here of compromise, or so it would seem, we're going to have constitutional amendments added. Now remember, we've only had 27, going all the way back, and 10 of those are the Bill of Rights, 1791. Officially, that James Madison, remember, did not want to add. Politically, he had to, so he adds them. He adds them to get everybody on board effectively in 1791. Well, what you see is a situation unfolding here. What in fact is going to formally unfold is in this case now it is moving on that the nation is looking to pass a constitutional amendment, first and foremost, for traditional American society. And here, traditional American society will have their victory. The passing of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment here to the Constitution is going to introduce prohibition. The impact that that has on the city of Milwaukee, holy mackerel, I'd go so far as to argue Milwaukee almost never recovered from it. The 9th largest city in 1910. German Athens, the most German place in the world outside of Germany in 1910. In 1920, it remains the most German place outside of Germany in 2026. And you have here all these breweries, Pabst and Miller and Schlitz. The list is endless. Shut it up. That's it. Countless scores of jobs here are lost. And in this situation, the belief was that this is going to help matters. So you have a victory here. You have a victory with the 18th Amendment for traditional America with the onset of Prohibition, the noble experiment, as it would be known as. The problem here is that Americans are still going to be drinking beer. Maybe not beer so much, but wine, whiskey. And you will have, especially from Canada, the smuggling process. There's big money to be made here. Woo! Across the Great Lakes. And you have for every 245 so-called bootleggers, you have one federal agent. And good luck with that in terms of stopping it. So you have here, it's all going to go underground. You've got speakeasies, okay, in different parts of the United States by the hundreds, by the thousands. The police are going to be paid off as well on the side to, basically not bust anybody, so on and so forth. Passwords that you would say here at the door to get in to these nightclubs, etc. And perhaps most significant of all, organized crime is going to skyrocket, the mafias. And who is making up part of the mafia? Well, I'll tell you straight out. Straight out, it is all, almost without exception, members of first-generation American society. Yeah. New immigrants. You've got the Italian mafia, the Irish mafia, and the Jewish mafia. And in this case, I think a prerequisite to be in the mafia at this time is you had to have the name Bugsy. You don't see too many kids being named Bugsy anymore. Probably because of that, no doubt. Bugsy Siegel, Bugsy Moran. At any rate, what happens here with the mafia is they're going to go into this illegal activity of trying to slip through the cracks of Prohibition. Al Capone, perhaps the best known of all the so-called gangsters here, John Dillinger in this time period as well, heading into the 1930s. So here, this noble experiment, what it's going to do is it's going to end up creating here more crime, now organized crime. Not being critical of traditional America at all. I would argue their heart was in the right place. But for all intents and purposes, it's a very large nation at this stage with the population approaching 123 million people. So here, as time moves on, it'll be a greater and greater challenge. Well, you have a victory for traditional America, you've got a victory for modern America. The Americans and their ability to compromise, bringing everybody together. We don't agree politically, but there's always that middle ground that we hold sacred that we need to come together on. And in this situation, as a follow-up, you're going to have another constitutional amendment. Remember, they're very, very rare. They're very rare. And here, women in this nation, the 19th Amendment will be granted the right to vote. Constitutional amendment is needed. 1 year after Prohibition, you have the women being granted the right to vote at the age of 21. When this happens here across the Atlantic Ocean, British women had been given the right to vote here in 1920. In 1920 as well, they'd been given here the right to vote a few months before. The American women had been given the right to vote, but they could not vote until they were 30, despite the fact that British males could vote at 21. So it's still an issue of the modern nations here, who had the right to vote first. Well, if you're talking the right to vote, British women. If you're talking at 21, here, the American women. But as soon as the British women found out the American women could vote at 21, they protested and they were granted a short time later the right to vote at 21 as well. So these two constitutional amendments here would be added as a side note to Prohibition. Prohibition is going to be the only amendment that also is only going to come into existence. The 18th Amendment, as we stressed here to the Constitution, it will also here effectively be the only constitutional amendment that is also having a constitutional amendment to, in fact, be repealed, which is the 21st Amendment. Prohibition, by 1933, the noble experiment failed. And during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency here, you will have a new constitutional amendment effectively repealing prohibition. For this nation here, when you get into World War I, what it does is it unifies the country in a very, very significant fashion. And at the start of the war, the United States proclaims here its strict neutrality, but it's very, very pro-Allied, very favorable here to the British and to the French and to the Russians. But you also have in American society, especially coming forth from the new immigrant class, if you're a German American or you're an Austrian American, first generation, second generation, you've got brothers, sisters, perhaps even parents back in the old world. And you are cheering here for the Central Powers, for Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., against the big allies at this time, Britain, France, and Russia. By the same token, if you're an Irish American, you hate the British with an absolute passion. Eamon de Valera, eventual Taoiseach of Ireland, said regarding Irish Americans, my concern is they hate Britain more than they love Ireland. I would say that was pretty dead-on accurate. Because as long as Ireland was controlled by the British, the Irish always felt to a place that they didn't even have their own country. They were dominated there, and then until that happened, that Ireland was effectively independent, they would not be able to throw off this yoke of second-class standing. Well, in this situation, the Irish Americans, they're going to be cheering for the Germans too, because they hate the British. Jewish Americans, they're going to be cheering for, certainly not cheering for the Russians, they're going to be cheering for the Central Powers as well. Because they hate the Russians, because of the pogroms here and the assaults and the tens of thousands of lives that were lost here wave after wave of the 1880s and 1890s, which brought countless millions of them to this nation, to this new land. Well, in this case, what happens is eventually, once the United States gets involved, April 6, 1917, nearly 3 years into this war, a war that would take the lives of 15 million people, you have here, in essence, this rallying around the flag. You have here this coming together, coming together. If you're a German American living in Milwaukee or wherever, you put that down under wraps. Okay? Because sauerkraut became called Liberty cabbage in this nation. Frankfurters were hot dogs. Okay? I mean, none of that. Okay? Very, very strong anti-German sentiment because of the war here and because of Germany being the centerpiece for the Central Powers in the war that took so many lives. An entire generation of young men lost predominantly on the Western Front. Well, in this time period, for the Americans, the United States is going to emerge as the world's predominant power exclusively, 1915, even though it does not get itself involved in this First World War until April 6, 1917. And even though it is not fully mobilized with these other orange nations, as we see on our slide, until May of 1918, 6 months before the war effectively ends. 58,000 Americans died here in World War I. You had 63,000 more American soldiers dying in World War I due to the Spanish flu epidemic, 1918, 1919. Took more lives of American soldiers, the flu epidemic, than was the case here with the battling here on the Western Front in northern France and Belgium in the backdrop of the First World War. You have here a nation. You have a nation here that is brought together for the most part during this war. And a nation that starts the domination of the 20th century the exact year 1915, as the U.S. is now outproducing Britain, France, and Germany combined by a rate of more than 3 to 1 in 1915 alone. The immigrant nation had done fairly well. Well, as time, in fact, here formally moves on, as time moves on, you have these changes that were instituted in the aftermath of World War I. We represented, or I should say we reference here the struggle between traditional and modern America. We reference as well prohibition, this 18th Amendment, which eventually would be overturned with another amendment in 1933. Women's suffrage here would also be effectively passed. The 19th Amendment in 1920. The Ku Klux Klan here is going to represent this anti-nativist surge. This should be a white nation for white people, especially Protestants. Catholics, Jews, you have no right to be here. You can never be good citizens. You're practicing these weird religions. Not true Christianity, you Catholics, that's for sure. That was the attitude on the part of mainstream Protestant America. And the Ku Klux Klan is going to be not only anti-immigrant and anti-black, as had been the case for generations, it will add here to its list Catholics and Jews. All these people here who are viewed as the outside, viewed here formerly on the fringe. As time marches on, the Great Migration continues, but there's also here, despite the economic progress, there's also a good deal of pressure to close the border, to effectively seal the borders. And you have traditional America as it's recognizing in the early 1920s that prohibition's probably not going to succeed. It might. It's still given a grade of an incomplete at this time. But they're finding a way that we've got too many people here. We've got 109 million people. There's soon going to be 123 million people by the early 1920s. And with support here, one of the largest supporters of all is the Ku Klux Klan, which reaches its absolute apex in membership by 1921. Wisconsin had countless Klan chapters here in 1921, the single largest Klan chapter in the entire United States, Indiana. The Immigration Act of 1921 is effectively passed. And with this Immigration Act, immigration is going to be significantly curtailed. It will be dropped here more than 60%. Followed up in 1924 by the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. The Johnson-Reed Immigration Act here, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act is virtually going to reduce newcomers to this nation to a mere trickle. The new immigrant movement officially ends, you could say, in 1921. By 1924 here, 95% of newcomers will be sealed. There's going to be small quotas from select nations. And once those quotas are filled every year, that's it. The nativist response was very strong indeed. I'm not saying that was right. I'm not saying it's wrong. Basically here talking as to what happens. Well, as the century progresses, the United States will pass, it's going to pass here a number of other constitutional amendments. A lot of this compared to like prohibition and women's suffrage, a lot of this is more tweaking, fine-tuning, etc. It is very, very difficult to pass an amendment. Now, if I am a congressman in the present day or even a U.S. senator, what I would do is to get myself here on television perhaps, is propose a new amendment because it would make me look like a big deal. Well, there's almost no way in hell I'm going to succeed, so I could just be wasting my time and I might not even be acknowledged for what I'm doing. It is very, very difficult, and this is what the Founding Fathers also wanted. It's a flexible living document, this oldest constitution in all of world history, up to and including the present day. A flexible document, but it's also tough here to have changes. Well, the 17th, here's what I mean by a little bit of tweaking. The 17th constitutional amendment involved the direct election of senators. It's passed in 1913. Because remember, going all the way back to 1787 in Philadelphia, what they have here is going to be the state legislatures who are appointing U.S. senators. They're not going to be directly elected. Well, it's a bit elitist, putting it mildly. So now what you're going to have is of 1913, constitutional amendment is going to be added. American senators here, you got 2 each state. We know that going back to the compromise, the Virginia plan here, heading back to James Madison, the father of the Constitution, 1787. You're going to have these senators directly elected. You're still going to run, just like the Constitution said. Once every 6 years, you'll have a senatorial election. Unlike the House of Representatives where you're up for every 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. But in this case here, it's going to be elected just like the members of the House would be elected. 1933, the inaugural date's going to be changed. May seem bizarre, but it's etched here in stone that the inaugural date is going to take place. It is going to take place here in early March. And the presidential election is going to be held here on the first Tuesday in November. So in this sense, if you're the president-elect and you're elected here at the very start of November, you're not going to be able to do anything until March when you're inaugurated. So it's way too much time, and especially here for the lame duck president who's there, if he has hostility, especially if he ran against you in the election and lost, well, he could make things a little bit more difficult. So you change here the inaugural date. You're going to change it from March. Franklin Roosevelt was the last American president formally inaugurated in March, his first term in office. You're going to change that from March here, push it back into January, which it is in the present day. 21st, the repeal of Prohibition, 1933, I referenced that. 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, 1951. The Republicans were livid, absolutely livid, and I can guarantee you if the roles reversed, the Democrats would have had the same attitude. Franklin Roosevelt's elected president, 1932, 1936. Washington began the trend. You serve 2 terms as president, a 4-year term. If you want to run for a second 4-year term, that's great. Run for a second 4-year term, you're elected, you're done. Why? Officially? No. There's nothing in the Constitution that said at this time that you could only serve here 2 terms. Well, Franklin Roosevelt serves his first term, his second term. His second term's wrapping up in 1940. And there's no way on God's green earth he would have run for a 3rd term in office. But World War II is on. World War II is on. He was quite frankly unpopular. Unpopular not just with the Republicans. He'd always been unpopular with the opposition party. But unpopular with his own Democratic Party. They saw him as somebody who was abusing his power. Well, with World War II being on, Roosevelt decides to run for this unprecedented 3rd term in office. He defeats Wendell Willkie in 1940. He then decides in 1944, because the war still isn't over, to run for an unprecedented 4th term. He's elected as well. When he dies in office, Harry Truman succeeds him in April of 1945, and Harry Truman's going to win in 48, and dear God, the Democrats are just sitting around here in the White House for generation after generation. The Republicans are going to put an end to that. And in 1951, they're going to say to it here that you have presidential term limits. You can, as a president, the Republicans want to make it abundantly clear, crystal clear, only serve 2 terms as president. That's it. That's it. Now, if you want to abolish that, which is still on the records, of course, here, the 22nd Amendment, if you want to abolish that, that's fine. You need another constitutional amendment, just like you did for Prohibition. But term limits here will be instituted. It's not good, whether a Republican or Democrat, to be there more than 2 terms in office. What you may see in the future is a constitutional amendment proposed for the executive branch, the chief executive, the president, to serve 1 term only. 1 6-year term, that's it. Because the problem here is that when you're elected to a 4-year term, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference if you're a Democrat or Republican. What you're doing is you're running to get reelected. To get reelected, and especially that first term in office. You don't want to be a 1-termer. So in this situation here, it's probably easier. You get 1 6-year term, just like a senator would. Senators can be reelected, presidents can't. In this situation, that could be a potential amendment. It's been proposed a couple of times. It really hasn't caught on, and I'm not sure if it's going to, but it would make a good deal of sense, logically. 1964, the poll tax was abolished. 24th Amendment, what was the poll tax? The poll tax here was effectively used on people who were poor, people here who were also minorities in this nation, who were going to have to pay taxes to actually vote. And if they didn't pay here a set amount, they weren't paying enough in taxes, I should say, they couldn't vote. Well, that's against the law. It's against the law. You have the right to vote. So to make this abundantly clear, these poll taxes that were used especially here in the South were abolished, 1964, during the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It also opens the door simultaneously for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, July of that year, which is considered by historians to be the single most important piece of legislation ever passed in all of U.S. history, making us more of a democracy than this nation had ever been before. 1967, presidential succession, an amendment added then, in terms of the technicalities of what happens here if a president resigns or a president is ill or dies, etc. Or you have the same thing happen with the vice president. What's the steps here across the board, just to make it clear. Again, more of a little bit of housekeeping than anything else. 1971, 26th Amendment. Voting age is lowered here to 18. It had been 21 for centuries, literally. Now it will be dropped. Now it will be formally dropped to 18 as you legally become an adult at that age as well. And finally, the 27th Amendment. 27th Amendment, congressional pay limits. Again, this is just the most recent amendment, 1992. You have here with this 27th and final amendment of congressional pay limits, what it does is basically, it's not all that exciting. What members of the House could do is they could vote here on their own raises. Woo! Anybody in favor of a raise? Yeah, perfect, awesome. And they could do it pretty much at any time. And well, we're just keeping up with, you know, in terms of the standard of living, et cetera. We've got commuting costs back to South Dakota, so on and so forth. This is what we need to survive. I could stay with my present job back in South Dakota and make a lot more money than I am as a member of the House of Representatives, I'll tell you that much. Well, here you can do this, but it can only be done here after the election every 2 years. Okay? So you can't, in essence, just keep voting yourself pay raises. And it's smacked here of impropriety, understandably so. So that would be formally removed. I mean, for congressmen, they're not supposed to be taking gifts as well, et cetera. Things are made abundantly clear, so no conflict of interest. Makes a lot of sense across the board. You have had here in the Constitution, going all the way back to the Bill of Rights, a total of 11,740 amendments. 11,740 constitutional amendments. And of those, only 27 make it through. And technically, since 1791, if my math skills are correct, only 17 have made it through. So it's very, very, very difficult, and that's probably a good thing. It's probably here a good thing. And you can see with a lot of these changes, some of them were monumental, no doubt, especially after the American Civil War. By the same end here, a lot of these, it's more like just housekeeping and making things crystal clear that were left a bit vague by the founding fathers. For all intents and purposes now, as a nation, is celebrating its 250th birthday here, effectively July 4th. What you have is you have this extraordinary document, which I had talked about here. It's far from perfect. James Madison knew it was far from perfect. All those who were signing here the original document, 55 were present when things wrapped up officially in Philadelphia in the summer, or I should say September of 1787. They knew it was far from perfect. But by the same end here, changes could be made, amendments could be made effectively. And you need to have 2/3 of the support for this to, in fact, effectively take place. The situation here is, for all intents and purposes, it's a pretty impressive document. And as Gerald Early had said at the very start, the United States, when historians look here at this great land of ours 1,000 years from now, they're going to recognize the 3 big contributions on the part of the United States as a whole. One of them was the United States Constitution. The other 2, of course, jazz music and baseball. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all before we formally wrap up? Yes, ma'am. Oh, there's a whole, in fact, I've got to look up to see exactly what the 23rd is. A number of those I skipped over because we didn't do, because some of them are, let's see here. Oh, 23rd Amendment, 1961, Washington, D.C. The residents there could take part in presidential voting. Again, a little bit more housekeeping, in essence, because Washington, D.C., we have 50 states, of course, in this nation. Washington, D.C. is always clamoring to become a state. And it's more of an exercise in futility. But that's what they're looking for, because it's a case of they don't really have any representation on a federal level because of that. When this was a step forward in that, to not necessarily in terms of making it a state by any stretch, but to at least allow them to participate in presidential elections. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
One thing they all had in common was they were all white.
Yep.
And no matter where you are
Yep.
in the ladder of, in the white ladder,
Yep.
you were always, and this was as true in the North as it was in the South,
Yep.
you were always higher up than even the richest, the brightest
Yep.
black person.
I agree 100%, and that's a huge aspect of it because, like, for example, I was talking about the whole Catholic issue, or Jewish issue for that matter. But the fact is, I mean, I could be standing up before you, for all you know, Tim Crain could be a closet Protestant. You don't know. Because I'm telling you, I'm a good Catholic boy, but maybe I just, talk the Catholic talk. At any rate, you don't know. You don't know. But if you saw me here as a person of color, it'd be a different story. Not in terms of my religion, but as to where I belong from a standpoint of a historical framework. And therein rests the danger. And therein rest the problems and the challenges, because it became easier, not just here patting the Irish on the back for being the first, the trailblazers, because we can criticize them just as easy as I was using them as an example, my own ethnic group, that they then look down upon the Poles and the Italians, which is so ludicrous and so ridiculously stupid and embarrassing, but they did it. But by the same end, the Poles, the Italians, as this gentleman said, and dead on accurate, could all fit in, could all blend in because they were white. And this is where you have some major challenges in the present, in the past, obviously. We have them in the present, we have them in the future as well. And it becomes easier. I mean, John Kennedy, for example, when he was on the campaign trail in 1960, his attitude was, okay, I had heard that this anti-Catholicism was going to be bad. I never expected this. Dear God, this is ridiculous. This is obscene. When he's standing before the Baptist bishops here in Houston and trying everything he can to not be sarcastic if he's asking if he's going to be contacting the Pope on a daily basis, telling him what to do if he becomes President of the United States from the Oval Office. For Catholic Americans, it was insulting. But again, it's easier. It's easier. Symbolically, that's the final stage for assimilation, 1960, the Holy Grail for Catholics. But by the same end here, it was also very, very easy to fit in, very easy to blend in, comparatively. So yeah, I would agree with your comment 190%. Any other comments? Oh, yes, sir.
The suffragette movement, you lost me there. So
Mhm.
traditional movement, Anglo-Saxon in the United States, no, we're not going to let women vote.
Mhm.
So how in the world in England, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, did the women's suffragette movement get moving?
It gets moving on the basis that Britain becomes a tremendously wealthy nation in the 19th century. And for many women, they still represented a small minority, about 6% of the population. But they were of the upper class, and they were also here, had degrees from Cambridge, from Oxford, et cetera, in many cases advanced degrees. Some of them were physicians, et cetera, and they did not have the right to vote. And yet here, all adult males here, as the enfranchisement is going to continue over the course of the 19th century, becoming all the more inclusive for males, to the stage that everybody who's an adult male at 21 could vote. This was utterly absurd. And they were viewed as too emotional to make the right decision. I've said it before, I'll say it again. In the college classroom, the 25 best students I've had, 22 of them were female. You could say, oh, Tim Crain. I'd say, oh, what? You say they're probably just better in history. No, they're better students. They're smarter. And you want your best and brightest in positions of authority. And so in this case, women decided enough's enough. And furthermore, they've been promised by William Gladstone and the Liberal Party here on the floor of the House of Parliament, in Commons, I should say, that we're going to get you. We're going to pass this Bill of Rights. I should say we're going to pass here the right for you all to vote. And it's just kind of like, oh, yes, we'll get to it. They'll go away. Eventually, the conservatives here under Benjamin Disraeli, they had no support for this whatsoever. Just be patient, it'll happen. Well, by the time we get to the early 20th century, it still hasn't happened. 1912, they're going to go and start breaking stuff up. That's not ladylike, but it gets the attention. It gets the attention here, smashing these storefront windows, going on hunger strikes, etc. They're not going to take this anymore. The American suffragettes do not have to go to that same extent, but they're monitoring closely what Emmeline Pankhurst here and the British suffragettes are in fact doing. And you want to, if you call yourself a democracy, you want to, I mean, France, for example, the nation of France does not allow women the right to vote until 1947. So I mean, it's a sense, if history teaches us anything, there's one race, the human race. The common bonds that we all share are far more significant than our divides, and I can die a happy little historian when that is, in fact, formally recognized and embraced. I'm not going to hold my breath, unfortunately. So it's a sense that it transitions, it translates over, and eventually you have a very, very progressive outlook here in the early 20th century in Britain, and finally it happens, though not until 1920. Any other questions? Oh, yes, sir.
Is there any future for challenging Second Amendment.
Second Amendment. What is the Second Amendment? Off the top of my head, I don't know. I don't remember. Second Amendment. I thought is that the Second Amendment? Right to bear arms? Okay, as part of militias. Okay. I would say that for the Second Amendment, probably not. I would say that it was, or at least not in our lifetime. I would say that from the basis here is the Bill of Rights, which James Madison added. The reason for it, and of course, some of these things are a bit lost. 1791 is obviously significantly different than 2026. The founding fathers aren't visionaries. I mean, the vast majority of them, remember, want nothing to do in terms of talking about the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the institution of slavery because the majority of them are slave owners. You have people like Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania, who is an absolute opponent of slavery, brings this up in as many speeches times and time again. Nothing's going to happen to it. There's nothing they can do ultimately. With the Bill of Rights, and you get into here the right to bear arms, the way it most likely was meant was for the smaller states who had already made it abundantly clear that they were not going to be ratifying this Constitution if they did not have in writing, and actually it started in Massachusetts, the right to bear arms. The right here to bear arms for their own militias, et cetera, keep their own militias, so on and so forth. And the reason being is that a lot of the states here, as we talked about, didn't trust. I mean, Rhode Island didn't even send any delegates. They didn't trust the situation. So in this case here, for the powers that be, you're going to add this to the Constitution. Yes, you have the right to bear arms. You don't want to give up these arms because what if this experiment here for this new nation doesn't work? And what if you're from the state of Connecticut, and Connecticut here is getting the short end of the stick? You're not going to want anything to do with this. South Carolina here is getting used and abused. You want out. Well, the federal government's big and bad, and in this situation, you have no choice. They're going to force you to stay in. You're not going to be able to struggle against this, at least not in terms of any sort of arming the state of South Carolina, if you do not have this right. And that could easily be swept aside. So it's meant generally here in the late 1700s, this right to bear arms for the individual states to make it more palatable. Remember, you have James Madison. He didn't want to add any of these 10 amendments. Trial by jury, a lot of it he thought was redundant or something that could be addressed later. He didn't want to add it. He had to do it because otherwise it wouldn't be ratified effectively. So he adds it. You have in this nation in the present day about 343 million people. You have here at least 400 million guns. Some estimates go as high as 500 million guns. There's at least 400 million guns. And in this situation here, the level of violence, of course, just continues. It's like mass shootings have become so common that it doesn't even faze me. When it just is like a case now, they're continue like, oh, well, it's a situation for, thoughts and prayers. It's a terrible thing. And nothing's ever done. In fairness, and not walking right down the middle of the road, even if you have, okay, you could say outlaw AK-47s, et cetera, I get it, I understand. But even in this situation, it's so far gone. I mean, what are you going to do here? 400 million guns, minimum, in a nation of not even close to that. The vast majority of Americans own at least one gun. I don't own any guns. But it's a case here, how are you going to get, what can be done? What steps can be taken? I mean, you can obviously hear people going out with AK-47s, that should not be allowed. But you have, from a political perspective, it's a very, very polarizing issue. And then it's a right, it's crystal clear, because then you could have advocates, as I started off talking about here, with birthright citizenship, who would say, well, this wasn't the way it was meant back in 1865. Well, was it or wasn't it? This is what it states, and it states clearly, because remember I was saying the Supreme Court, 3 justices voted against, which is crystal clear regarding birthright citizenship as the 14th Amendment. So, with the right to bear arms, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you have the vast majority of Americans support gun control, but nothing really ever happens of any great significance. So as to whether, if there will be or won't be, tough to say. It's tough to say. But its original meaning versus the way then that it was interpreted, and I'm not saying 1791 is obviously different than the 21st century. So if you had a crystal ball and you could see, well, that's a different story. But going back to Madison and many of the delegates, they wanted to have this, not necessarily vague, but they wanted to keep it the way it was. They didn't want to add those Bill of Rights, and they wanted this to be as flexible as possible for future generations. They made it difficult to get amendments, but by the same end, it's also here, there's some challenges. Life is imperfect. The U.S. Constitution is imperfect as well. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful summer. Take care. I look forward to seeing you again this fall. Thank you. Any other questions? Swing on up.